He didn't just reshape economics, he rewired how governments think about risk, authority, and money itself. John Maynard Keynes wasn't a statesman or a traditional revolutionary. He was something far rarer, a thinker who taught entire nations how to spend their way out of misery. For centuries, taking on debt was treated like a vice. Running deficits was considered a moral failure. Balanced budgets were viewed as proof of honest leadership, a kind of fiscal purity. But Keynes inverted that moral code. He told governments that spending in a crisis wasn't reckless, it was responsible. He recast debt as duty and made saving look selfish. In doing so, he rewrote the operating logic of capitalism. The story opens in the ruins of the Great Depression. Picture the world in 1930. Banks collapsing, factories shut, millions unemployed. The old economic rulebook, built on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, insisted the market would self-correct, supply and demand would realign, prices would fall until consumers bought again. Recovery in theory required nothing but patience, but theory doesn't feed a starving family. In reality, demand didn't return, businesses didn't reopen, and terrified citizens, desperate to protect whatever they had left, stopped spending entirely. The economy wasn't healing, it was freezing. This was the landscape Keynes studied, and he realized something revolutionary. Markets aren't perfect. They don't always repair themselves. Sometimes they become trapped in a loop of fear. When people cut spending, companies stop hiring. When firms stop hiring, incomes collapse. And as incomes fall, spending drops even further. It becomes a downward spiral, an economic black hole. Keynes understood that the problem wasn't a lack of discipline or thrift. It was a lack of demand, money moving through the system. Put simply, recessions happen when everyone tries to save at the same time, and in a paradox, that collective caution makes society poorer. He called it the paradox of thrift. What helps a single household, cutting expenses, saving cash, becomes devastating when practiced by everyone, because one person's spending is someone else's paycheck. When spending dies, the economy's pulse stops. So Keynes proposed something unthinkable for his era. If private demand collapses, public demand must take its place. The government must intervene, borrow money, hire workers, build infrastructure, and push cash back into circulation. That spending would create jobs. Jobs would generate income. Income would lead to consumption. And that consumption would restart the engine. To traditional economists, this was insanity. Governments weren't meant to interfere. Deficits were dangerous. Debt was poison. But Keynes saw it differently. He wasn't claiming debt was inherently good. He argued that timing was everything. He believed governments should act counter-cyclically, spend during recessions, save during expansions, stimulate in downturns, restrain in booms, not one strategy, but a rhythm. His metaphor was simple. The economy, he said, is like a car. Under normal conditions, the private sector drives, but when the engine stalls, the government must turn the key, inject fuel until it fires again. Once moving, the government steps aside. That's how motion survives. In his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, Keynes developed this insight into a full system. He introduced aggregate demand, the total spending of consumers, businesses, and the government. When that demand falls, output and employment fall with it. The only way to restore both is to increase spending, directly or indirectly, until confidence returns. But this wasn't just mathematics. Keynes believed economics was psychology. Markets, he said, are driven by what he famously called animal spirits, the hopes, impulses, and fears that make people invest or hide their money. You can't fix those emotions with equations. You fix them through action, unified, visible action. When governments spend, they do more than purchase materials and hire people. They send a message. We believe recovery is coming. That belief becomes economic fuel. That was Keynes's insight, that confidence, not austerity, ends recessions. But his ideas didn't instantly conquer the world. In the early 1930s, global leaders clung tightly to the old faith of austerity. Britain returned to the gold standard, strangling its exports. Germany slashed public spending to prove discipline and drove its economy into turmoil, helping extremism rise. And in the United States, Herbert Hoover, facing the worst economic collapse in modern history, resisted large-scale intervention, convinced the market would recover on its own. It didn't. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was jobless. Bank failures erased life savings. The free market had frozen into silence. That's when Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into the vacuum, not an economist, but a leader whose instincts aligned with Keynes's logic. He didn't call it Keynesianism yet, but the idea was identical. When fear stops consumers from spending, the government must spend in their place. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't a single law, it was an entire mindset. Massive public projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Hoover Dam employed millions. The Works Progress Administration paid artists, teachers, and builders. The government became the economy's largest customer, injecting wages directly into its bloodstream, and slowly, it worked. Demand returned. Morale improved. By the late 1930s, the United States was climbing out of the abyss, though not yet fully healed. It would take something far more massive and far more tragic to prove Keynes's ideas beyond doubt. That event was war. When World War II ignited, governments worldwide did exactly what Keynes had urged for years: spend without restraint. Factories reopened, not to produce consumer goods, but tanks, ships, and bombs. Governments borrowed enormously, not to stimulate, but to survive, and unemployment disappeared in the middle of a global catastrophe. The irony was cruel. Total war became the ultimate Keynesian experiment, and it worked. Production skyrocketed, wages climbed, economies roared back to life, even while cities burned. It wasn't prosperity, but it was proof. Massive government spending could end a depression. After the war, Keynes's theories weren't just respected, they became doctrine. His influence shaped everything that followed: the Bretton Woods framework, post-war rebuilding, the rise of the welfare state, and the long golden age of growth from 1945 to 1973. Keynes had given capitalism a second act, managed by governments, stabilized by policy, and built on the belief that prosperity lives in movement, not austerity. But like every brilliant idea, it carried a hidden cost. Because once societies realize spending can solve any crisis, they also learn they can delay responsibility forever. After WWII, Keynes wasn't just an economist, he became a prophet. Nations rebuilt using his blueprint. They'd seen firsthand that debt could buy time, spending could buy stability, and full employment could buy peace. Europe lay in ruins, yet Keynes's logic made reconstruction seem achievable. The Marshall Plan, the welfare state, and the social contracts that defined modern democracy were all rooted in one principle: demand must never be allowed to collapse. Factories that once made weapons now produced cars and appliances. Soldiers returned home to jobs building the world they'd fought to save. And behind that prosperity was a quiet revolution. Governments no longer waited for markets to act. They intervened. Through the 1950s and 60s, Keynesianism became more than theory. It became the free world's operating system. Public works, cheap loans, unemployment insurance, housing programs, infrastructure, all tools to support consumption and prevent collapse. Recessions were shorter, recoveries were faster. The business cycle, once treated like the weather, was now something policymakers believed they could control. For the first time, capitalism was on a leash, and Keynes had handed the leash to the state. But this success created a hidden dependency. The more governments used spending to smooth downturns, the harder it became to stop. Politicians realized voters loved stimulus, but hated saving. Keynes's golden rule, run surpluses in good times, was abandoned. By the late 1960s, the system began to overheat. Prices rose, wages followed. The delicate balance between growth and inflation started slipping, and when the oil shocks of the 1970s hit, the world discovered the limits of Keynesian control. Stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, wasn't supposed to exist. Keynesian theory said they were opposites, but soaring oil prices broke the model. Economies were drenched in cash but starved of energy. Governments tried to spend their way out, but this time spending made inflation explode. Faith in Keynes faltered. A new doctrine emerged: monetarism, championed by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. They argued excessive government interference distorted the market. Inflation, they insisted, was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. For a moment it seemed Keynesianism was dead, but economic ideas don't die, they evolve. Even as the world embraced austerity, deregulation, and tight money in the 1980s, the core of Keynes's thinking, that governments must intervene, never disappeared. It simply went quiet, waiting for the next disaster. That disaster came in 2008, when global markets collapsed under their own excesses. The old reflex returned. Governments that preached restraint suddenly rediscovered the power of spending. Bailouts, stimulus, quantitative easing, all descendants of Keynes's playbook, but on a scale he could not have imagined. Trillions were printed, interest rates dropped to zero. Central banks didn't just influence the economy, they became the economy, and once again it worked. Temporarily, the system didn't disintegrate, confidence came back, markets soared, but the recovery revealed a new flaw, one Keynes never accounted for. He assumed government spending would flow into households, workers, and industries, the real economy. But in the 21st century, money moves differently. Stimulus poured into financial markets, not factory floors. It inflated assets, not wages. Stocks surged, housing skyrocketed, inequality exploded. Governments had learned how to restart the engine, but now they were overfueling the wrong side. Then came the pandemic, and Keynes returned once more, this time in pure form. Governments didn't hesitate. They borrowed and spent at an unbelievable pace. Direct checks were mailed out. Central banks printed trillions overnight. It was Keynes without restraint, a worldwide experiment in fiscal adrenaline. For a moment it looked miraculous. Unemployment vanished. Markets hit all-time highs. Even as the world shut down, economies appeared lively. Then the bill arrived. Inflation surged. Supply chains broke. And governments faced the same problem again. The cure that saved the system had weakened it. Keynes had designed a tool to stabilize capitalism. But what happens when that tool becomes the system? Today, nearly a century after the general theory, Keynes's logic is everywhere, and that ubiquity is the danger. Whenever growth slows, leaders reach for the same lever: stimulate, borrow, spend, inflate, repeat. But every rescue makes the system a little more dependent, a little more indebted, and a little more fragile. The government is no longer the spender of last resort. It has become the spender of first resort, and sometimes the only one left. Modern politicians use Keynesianism without its limits. They run deficits in expansions, and in recessions. They spend not to stabilize, but to win elections. The balance Keynes envisioned, restraint in good times, support in bad, has been replaced with permanent stimulus disguised as policy, yet his brilliance endures. Keynes didn't hand governments a blank check. He gave them a mirror. He showed that economics isn't just numbers, it's psychology, belief, trust. When people lose confidence, they stop spending. And when spending stops, economies die. Keynes crafted a theory to keep that belief alive, even when everything else collapses. But here's the haunting truth. The modern world runs on belief without boundaries. The system Keynes saved has turned his medicine into addiction. Every crisis brings more spending, and every dose makes the next crisis harder to survive. Today's markets don't fear recession, they fear withdrawal. Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." He meant it as a warning that governments shouldn't wait for the invisible hand to fix what people can't endure. But over time it became something else, an excuse to borrow endlessly, to delay consequences, to live permanently in the short run. And that's the paradox of John Maynard Keynes. He didn't destroy capitalism, he rescued it, repeatedly. But in saving it, he made it vulnerable, dependent, fragile. The man who taught governments to spend also taught them how to forget restraint. If this shifted your perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to find them.